Hello everyone, I'm here to talk about reversing XProtect Remediator. My name is Ko. I'm a cybersecurity researcher at Prescott FFR Security, which is a Japanese security company conducting a wide range of security research. I'm mainly working on Apple product security, especially macOS security. Previously, I gave talk at Bracket Asia, EU, and Codeblue. I want to say this presentation is a deeply technical look at the XProtect Remediator, or XPR. I walk you through how XPR detection logic works, what kinds of malware are targeted by XPR. I will also talk about Provenance sandbox, which XPR utilizes. Just to be clear, this presentation does not cover an evaluation of XPR, so I won't be discussing how effective it is as a macOS security product. Also, I'm not going to talk about the traditional XProtect, which is built on AV on macOS, so if you're interested in that, I highly recommend checking out the Stuart excellent talk. So what do you gain from this talk? You will walk away with a deep technical understanding of XPR. That's especially valuable for blue chimmer, but I believe this benefits red chimmer as well. For blue chimmer, you learn how XPR detects and removes malware. This will help you understand its capabilities more clearly, and you also get insights into Apple exclusive threat intelligence embedded in XPR. This will help you understand lesser-known malware that hasn't been publicly documented. For red chimmers, you learn about some vulnerabilities in XPR and Provenance sandbox. This knowledge will help you discover new zero days in the future. Here's the outline of this presentation. First, I give them background information so we are on the same page, then move on to the tooling I used. After that, I walk you through the reversing results along with a bit of vulnerability research, and finally, we'll come to a conclusion. So what is XProtect Remediator in the first place? According to the Apple's platform security document, XProtect Remediator, or XPR, is the third layer of macOS malware defense. The first and second layers include the App Store Review, Notification, Gatekeeper, and the traditional XProtect. These two layers are designed to prevent malware from being executed or distributed. But XPR kicks in after the malware is executed. Its job is to detect and remove malware that's actively running on the system. XPR was introduced in macOS Monterey as a replacement for malware removal tool, MRT. Since then, MRT has stopped receiving updates. Now only XPR is updated, typically once or twice a month. As of today, XPR contains more than 20 scanning modules, and it's believed that each one targets a specific malware family. For example, a binary named XProtect Remediator Adroit is a scanner that removes well-known Adroit adware. There's other XPR scanners like XProtect Remediator, BadGacha, Bluetop, Banro, etc., etc. So why is remediation needed? It's because some malware sample can bypass the first and second layers of defense. For example, in the 3.6 supply chain attack reported 2 years ago, the Trojanized 3.6 app was neutralized by Apple, meaning that it passed Gatekeeper checks and launched successfully. Also, some malware uses social engineering to trick users into disabling Gatekeeper. In both cases, a malware can strip the first and second layers of defense, so Apple needs a way to detect and remove malware that's actively running on the system. But why do we care? First, from an offensive security perspective, XPR are attractive targets because they come with a powerful entitlement, like full disk access. So bugs in XPR could potentially lead to TCC bypass. In fact, Gary Carman published an exploit on Twitter that demonstrates how to gain a full disk access primitive via one of the XPR scanners. Also, XPR scanner run with both root and user privileges, meaning that a vulnerability in XPR could potentially lead to user-to-root privilege escalation. From a defensive security perspective, XPR is also an interesting target for reversing. Since Apple tends to use its own naming scheme for malware, several malware families targeted by XPR remain unknown. Researchers like Howard Oakley, Alden Schmidt, and Phil Stock have identified some of these, but several still remain unknown due to the lack in depth reversing. Also, XPO's remediation logic is too unclear. It seems to simply scan files using YARA and delete any that match, but is that all? That's still an open question. The main research target is this application bundle, XProtect app. Inside this bundle and contains macOS directory, there are 23 different scanning modules. They're all about 2 MB in size. There's also a binary named XProtect, not to be confused with the traditional XProtect. There's an XPC service named XProtect plugin service. One notable thing is that these XPR-related binaries are written in Swift. As you can see on the slide, they include distinctive section names specific to Swift binaries, like SwiftUI entry, SwiftUI typeref, etc. I'd like to touch on related work. Periodically has published many blog posts about XPR. Out and Schmidt discovered that XPR contains secret strings that YARA rules, rules, and file path. Feedstock has compiled a list of XPR-related malware names. But as far as I know, I haven't seen any detailed reversing results of XPR. So next, let's move on to the tooling. How I did what I did. I analyzed more than 20 Swift binaries using Binary Ninja. Of course, these binaries are stripped, but surprisingly, some symbols can still be recovered. That's because I performed binary diffing using BNDIF and found that XPR scanners share functions with XProtect payload directives. This means we can import the symbols exported by that directive into the XPR scanners. That said, reversing XPR is still challenging because they are stripped Swift binaries. Swift binaries usually include type-related symbols, things like type metadata accessor and protocol within stable PWT. These symbols are rarely helpful for reversing since they tell us what kinds of objects are being instantiated. But in this case, those symbols are stripped as well. So there's very little structured information left to work with. But fortunately, even if the binaries are stripped, we can still access a lot of type information in the binary. That's because Swift supports reflection. Metadata is for reflection can be accessed through Swift-specific sections like SwiftUI protocols and SwiftUI types. And by extracting this metadata, we can recover type information. We can extract this type information using IPSW SwiftTemp command, which is created by Blacktop. But the extracted type information cannot be imported directly into a disassembler. That's why I developed a new Binary Ninja plugin called Binja SwiftUI Analyzer. I've just published on GitHub. This plugin is based on IPSW SwiftTemp, and it annotates type metadata accessor, PWT symbols, and class method to the disassembly listings. It also supports other features to help Swift reversing, like Swift string analysis. Here's a quick example. Without this plugin, it's harder to tell what this function is doing, what kinds of data is referenced. But after running the plugin, the function gets renamed to an appropriate type metadata accessor, giving us much more insight into this function. Here's another example. As we can see, before running the plugin, there's no type-related information available. So it's harder to tell what kinds of objects are being instantiated. But after running the plugin, a lot of type metadata gets annotated, giving us much more context information. I also developed dynamic analysis tools to help in Swift reversing. Swift binaries contains lots of indirect branches, such as call through variable and PWTs, and resolving the branch targets manually using LLDB can be tedious. My LLDB script captures these branch targets and exports them as a JSON file. The exported data can be imported via a Binja Missing plugin. Here's an example. The captured indirect branch targets can be imported into the Binary Ninja like this. This plugin also annotates protocol witness table and function symbols when possible. For instance, function is called through PWT. This plugin annotates which struct and which protocol are associated with that call. So it provides plenty of helpful information for reversing. I also created some custom LLDB commands. The standard expression command of LLDB doesn't properly handle complex Swift objects like existential containers. So I built some enhanced commands for dumping more Swift objects. Using these static and dynamic analysis tools, I was able to dig deeper into the XPR scanners. Next, let's move on to the reversing result. First, I will give you an overview of how remediation works. Here's an overview. The contents macOS XProtect binary is registered as both launch agent and launch daemons. Its execution is scheduled by .cds, which is a background task scheduler that runs based on system activities and available resources. When XProtect runs, it sends an XPC request to XProtect Plugin Service, which then kicks off the XPR scanners one after another. Each scanner includes its own remediation logic, which is written using remediation method DSL, and along with something called XP Plugin API. While remediating threads, the scanner also collects provenance attributes of files. This allows them to identify where each remediator file originally came from. And finally, remediator thread information is reported back to Apple. OK, then let's talk about how each XPR scanner is initialized. Each XPR scanner has a function called model_init_func0, which runs before its entry point. Its role is to decrypt sensitive strings used for remediation, such as file path, YARA rules, and regular expressions. These sensitive strings are encrypted using a simple XOR cipher. Decrypting these strings is important because they tell us a lot about how each XPR scanner works. Alden from Huntress originally decrypted these strings. He also provided a nice binge script for that. But some strings weren't successfully decrypted. He admitted that the output is not perfect. Therefore, I developed a custom LLDB script that decrypts all these strings. Here are a few decryption results. We can see things like hashes, file path, text messages, and YARA rules, etc., etc. After the model_init_func0 finishes, the scanner moves to its entry point. At this stage, the scanner creates an instance of its plugin class. For example, in the case of the add-load scanner, it creates an instance of the add-load plugin. Most XPR scanners define just one plugin class. Then the scanner creates an instance of the XP API helpers and passes it as an argument to the plugin main function. So what is XP API helpers? It provides access to various types of system information. Its capabilities are largely self-explanatory based on its property names. For example, it provides access to launch services, network settings, and keychain, and contents of process memory, etc., etc. Let's take a closer look at an interesting property in XP API helpers, which is called alert property. This property includes methods that use NSAlert to display dialog to users. I was surprised at this property because current XPR remedies threats silently without notifying the users. I haven't observed XPR making use of this property during my research, but the presence of this property suggests that GUI alerts may be introduced in the future update. Now, execution eventually goes to the plugin main function. This function creates an instance of the XP logger class, measure its performance data using OS signpost, remove environment variable, which is a fix for TC Symphonic vulnerabilities, verifies entitlements of XProtect plugin service, and enable Vino rapid aging. And after enabling Vino rapid aging, the remediation begins. Let me briefly explain what Vino rapid aging is, since it doesn't seem to be widely known. This feature suppresses the access time updates on a per-process basis. It can be enabled via syscontrol. XPR appears to be enabled this feature, possibly for performance improvement or to preserve forensic artifacts. This is disabled after the remediation finishes. Next, let's take a look at how XPR implements its remediation logic. Here, I'm going to introduce a set of domain-specific languages called Remediation Builder, which helps describe remediation logic in a clean and concise way. But before we get into detail, I'd like to start with my thoughts on why Apple decided to introduce their own DSL. Why was it needed in the first place? Remediation logic can sometimes get complicated, and when they do, the code tends to become quite verbose. For example, let's say we want to delete a file only if all the following conditions are met. The target file is located on the library application support directory. Its file size is 2 megabytes or smaller. Its format is macro, not notarized. It matches a specific error. And if the scanner is running as root, an additional directory should also be scanned. To implement this logic, we might write code something like that. First, enumerate files under library application support directory. Then filters files that are 2 megabytes or smaller. Then narrow them down to only macro file. Then checks which ones are not notarized. Finally, scan the file with the YARA root and delete any that match. If we also want to scan additional directory when running as root, we need to replicate this logic with extra conditions. This approach works, but it's not great in terms of readability and maintainability. If you want to add another condition, you have to insert yet another if statement, making the code even more cluttered. So how can we describe this logic more clearly and keeping maintainability? Apple's answer is to use Swift result builders. So what exactly are Swift result builders? They were introduced in Swift 5.4 to make it easier to write domain-specific languages. If you've ever worked with SwiftUI, you've already used them. They are used to describe UI declaratively. But they are not just for UI. More generally, they can be used to create a DSL for collecting multiple elements and building a single result, like generating structured data such as JSON and HTML. In XPR, Apple uses result builder to combine multiple conditions into the final remediation decision. Let's look at a simple example of Swift result builder, generating HTML. If you try to generate HTML dynamically in plain Swift, you'd end up with very verbose code, declaring intermediate variable for each element, nesting them manually, and so on. In this example, we want to add a specific H1 element only if the use chapter titles variable is set to true. To describe this, we assign a variable d1 header depending on the use chapter titles variable. It contains a lot of unnecessary detail. Just by looking at the code, it's hard to tell what the final HTML structure will be. Now here's the same example, but this time it's implemented using the DSL provided by result builders. It's much more readable. You don't need to declare unnecessary intermediate variable. Also, the structure of the generated HTML is clearly reflected in Swift code. These two blocks directly correspond to the two div elements. And even the conditions under which elements are added are easy to understand. For example, we can easily understand this HTML element is added only if the use chapter titles variable is set to true. It's almost like writing your own template engine, but you're building the DSL using Swift language feature. So what happens if we apply this idea to remediation logic? Remember the example from earlier. By using a DSL provided by result builders, we can express this much more clearly. Here's what the same logic looks like. You can clearly see what conditions are being checked. The target file must be under library application support directory. File size must be 2 megabytes or smaller. File format must be macro, must not be notarized, and it must match the specific YARA rule. When the scanner is running as root, additional directory is also scanned. It's concise, readable, and easy to maintain, right? This is exactly what Apple did. XPR comes with a set of DSL called Remediation Builder. It defines several enums, and each one provides a DSL for combining the remediation conditions. For instance, if you want to describe logic for file-related remediation, we can use the DSL provided by File Remediation Builder. Other DSLs are also available, such as Process Remediation Builder, Service Remediation Builder, and Safari App Extension Remediation Builder. Remediation Builder isn't used by all XPO scanners. As you can see here, it's used a subset of the scanners, such as Outload, BadGacha, Cardboard Cutout, and so on. The rest of the scanners rely on a lower-level API called XProtect API for their implementation. I've documented the Remediation Builder DSL specifications based on my reversing. I published it on GitHub repository. If you are interested in the details like how the DSL works and what kinds of conditions are available, feel free to check it out. Now let me show you a few rare examples to illustrate how this DSL is used in practice. First, let's take a look at the XProtect. This is a simple example that uses File Remediation Builder. As you can see on the slide, a file is removed only if the path is temp acre, and the file size is 68 bytes or more, and it matches the acre YARA rule. Yeah, pretty easy to understand. Next, let's take a look at the XProtect, which uses the Process Remediation Builder. It remediates running processes only if the process is not notarized and the backend file meets two conditions. First, the file path must contain certain strings, such as library application support or temp. And second, the file must match the Outload YARA rule. Interestingly, the conditions for the backend file can be described using File Remediation Builder. To verify my reversing results, I implemented Open Remediation Builder, an open source re-implementation of Remediation Builder. It is a minimum implementation that reproduces the behavior of XProtect. This project can help you understand how Swift result builders are used to implement Remediation Builder. All right, so let's take a closer look at the remediation logic of each scanner. Let's start with RoachFlight, which was introduced at the same time as XProtect. XProtect is designed to remove the payrolls using a 3.6 supply chain attack. As for XProtect, its decrypted strings are just two hash values. But what are these useful? Here the remediation logic described using Remediation Builder. As we can see, these two hash values are CD hashes. And it is designed to kill the process with those specific CD hashes. The first CD hash is a null one. This is a second stage payload used in a 3.6 supply chain attack, commonly referred to as upgrade agent. This sample was analyzed by Patrick Walter and presented at the BadGacha USA 2 years ago. The second CD hash remains unknown, but it's likely a variant of upgrade agent. As far as I know, only one version of the upgrade agent has been publicly documented, which I explained in the previous slide. The known version has limited capabilities. It only sends system information to the C2 server and doesn't perform any further actions. So Patrick Walter suggested that there might be other more functional variants. This unknown CD hash could support his hypothesis that other more capable version of upgrade agent might exist. Next up is XProtect. Its decrypted strings do not seem related to remediation, like right-click, click open. So what are these useful? As it turns out, it's related to the malware I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. At the beginning, I briefly mentioned the malware that uses social engineering to disable Gatekeeper. The background image of this disk contains strings like right-click and click open. That's exactly what XProtect is detecting, strings in the background image of the disk. XProtect enumerates multiple disks on the system, then it gets their background images and retrieves their text strings using OCR. After that, it searches for Gatekeeper bypass related strings like option click, right click, click open, and if it finds such strings, it reports them to Apple, including information about disk image. So which malware family does XProtect detect? Honestly, I don't think it's aimed at any specific one. In fact, XProtect can detect disk images used by multiple malware families, like Empire Transfer and the Chrome Loader. So Apple may have designed XProtect as a threat hunting scan to help identify new and emerging threats. Interestingly, XProtect used to have a mechanism to detect processes without their backing file. As you can see on the slide, this mechanism is implemented using remediation builder like this. This mechanism has been removed probably due to a high rate of false positives. Clearly, this logic itself is also a generic one. So this supports my hypothesis that XProtect is a generic threat hunting scanner. Lastly, let's talk about the XProtect, which I think is the most interesting scanner. Although it's now retired, it offers some unique insights. Its declarative strings are YARA and 4-file path. Interestingly, YARA detects the TriangleDB iOS implant. TriangleDB is a piece of malware used in Operation Triangulation, a highly sophisticated attack reported 2 years ago. Researchers at Kaspersky analyzed this attack and suggested that a macOS version of this implant might also exist. The macOS implant has not been publicly documented, but it is likely that XProtect was designed to detect that macOS implant. XProtect is granted the entitlement called Apple System Task Ports Read, which allows it to read arbitrary process memory. It runs two separate scans. One scans the memory of the running processes, and the other scans the loaded library path. The latter is called the loaded library scanner. The first scan checks whether a memory executable matches the YARA rule. In this scan, platform processes are excluded from the scan targets. Why does XProtect scan memory directory instead of the on-disk backing file? Normally, the XProtect scanners perform their scan on the on-disk backing file. My hypothesis is that the macOS implant runs entirely in memory, leaving no traces on disk. To catch it, scanning memory directory is necessary. That would make sense, considering that iOS implant was deployed entirely in memory as well. Next, let's take a closer look at the loaded library scanner. Here's the remediation logic. It checks whether a process has a specific loaded libraries based on file path. In this case, 4 file paths are specified: FM core framework, core location, AV foundation, and libSQL3 directive. Here, what really caught my attention were the paths themselves. Do these actually point to directive files? When I look at these paths, I notice something strange. Except for libSQL3 directive, the others don't point to real files. For example, core location and AV foundation are just symlinks. When these symlinks are loaded, their path gets resolved, so the loaded library scanner should specify the resolved path. What's even more puzzling is that FM core framework is a directory. And clearly, no legitimate process would load a directory as a directive. So what's going on here? There are a few possible explanations. One is that this is just a bug in XPR. Apple may have accidentally included the wrong path. Another possibility is that the macOS implant somehow bypassed SIP and SSV and used that to replace symlinks or directory with attacker control directive. But doing something like that would probably mess with the system. And macOS becomes unstable. It's pretty unlikely. So I'd like to propose a third hypothesis. The macOS implant used its own reflective loader. and loaded library scanner was designed to detect that. Researchers at Kaspersky pointed out that iOS implant used a reflective loader, and it's likely macOS implant implemented it as well. But when a div is loaded through a reflective loader, the backend file is usually empty. This was pointed out by Patrick Walter last year, and it is one of the few ways to detect reflective loading. But here's a thought. What if the implant set an arbitrary path as a backend file to make it safer? To test this, I implemented a new reflective loader based on Patrick's research. Using it, I was able to specify a directory as a backend file. Here's an example. As we can see here, the output of VM map, the directory path named FM Core Framework, is shown as a backend file. This suggests that macOS implant may have done something similar, using a custom reflective loader that assigns a fake backend file to binary. But there's still some mysteries. If you can specify any path as a backend file, why choose a directory symlink? Wouldn't it be more natural to use an unused library instead? Another pattern thing is that macOS RedPine never performs remediation. Even when it detects malware, it just reports it to Apple, nothing more. So if it's not designed to remove threats, what's the actual purpose of deploying this scanner? Unfortunately, since we haven't obtained a sample, the answer remains unclear. Due to the time constraint, I couldn't cover all my findings, but my reversing results are available on GitHub now. Please check the repository. It contains reversing result of 15 XPR scanners. It also contains useful scripts to simulate the remediation of XPR. I hope they help with your future research. Now let's talk about the Provenance sandbox. This is a cool mechanism that helps identify applications associated with remediator files. To begin, let me show a simple example to understand how XPR utilizes this mechanism. Let's look at a case where XPR removes malware that establishes persistence. Say there are 3 items that are being remediated, 2 malware payrolls, and payers file, and the launch agent directory. Now let's assume the cracked app drops the second stage payload, and the second stage payload then drops the third stage payload and the payers file. The problem is just by looking at the remediator files only, there's no way to tell which app dropped these files. This is exactly where Provenance Sandbox comes into play. When an app is launched for the first time, sysprocd records information about it into the XProtect database. As part of that, special provenance attribute is added to the cracked app. From then on, the app runs inside the Provenance sandbox, and any files it creates inherit the same provenance attribute. So when XPR attempts to remove files, it fetches the provenance attribute and can ask like, hey, which app created these files? Then XPR can trace back to the cracked app. So through Provenance Sandbox, XPR can determine which app originally dropped these remediator files. In other words, Provenance Sandbox allows XPR to trace a file back to its source application. Think of it like this. In the app sandbox, files dropped by a sandbox app gets tagged with a cronty attribute. In Provenance Sandbox, this tag is replaced with a provenance attribute. Just like App Sandbox, the Provenance Sandbox also propagates to child processes. The provenance attribute is set automatically for certain file operations as listed here, create, rename, set share, etc. The body of this provenance attribute is an 11-byte integer with 8 bytes being random. sysprocd generates this value and assigns it to the target application. So why does XPR collect provenance attribute in the first place? Because it's useful for discovering malware variants. For example, let's say multiple cracked apps are dropping the same second stage payload. Some of these apps are still unknown to Apple. When XPR remediates these payloads, it gets the provenance attribute to identify the source app and report that to Apple. With this data, Apple can uncover previously unknown cracked apps. This helps update XProtect YARA rule and certificate revocation list notification status accordingly. Provenance attribute also a variable for third-party vendor, not limited to Apple. It serves as a variable forensic artifact. For example, let's say we want to identify which application established persistence. If we check the provenance attribute of the PDS file in the launch agent directory, we can easily identify which app created it. We can also obtain signing information from the exit policy database. But this is just one example. I believe there are probably many more ways to take advantage of this. To demonstrate practical use cases of the provenance attribute, I've developed a tool which is now on GitHub. I've also added provenance data collection support to the macOS instance framework afterwards. I'll be submitting a pull request soon after this talk, so hopefully it will be available for everyone to use. Finally, I will talk about a bit of vulnerability research. I touched on the arbitrary file deletion vulnerability inspired by talk-to-back known as Aikido Viper, which was discovered in several ADR products. The idea is very simple. Trigger detection by ADR, then before the deletion occurs, serves the file with another target file. This allows the attacker to delete arbitrary file with admin privileges. This research focused only on Windows platform, but what about macOS? It turns out that XPA had a similar talk-to issue as well. The exploit is very simple. After YARA is matched, replace the file using symlinks to another target file. You can determine when the YARA rule is matched by checking the unifier log. As you can see here, it logs YARA rule hit. This allows attackers to trick XPR into deleting any file with its full disk access primitive. I also reported several ways to escape the Provenance sandbox. Surprisingly, previous app sandbox bypass worked for Provenance sandbox. For example, process launch via launch services was an easy way to bypass Provenance sandbox. Another example was launching application through XPC. These issues have already been addressed, but if you're looking to explore Provenance sandbox bypass, previous app sandbox bypass is a good place to start. So let's wrap up with a quick summary of this talk. We've explored how to reverse engineer XPR and discussed its internal structure and remediation logic. We also looked into Provenance sandbox, its brief overview, and how to utilize it. And finally, I shared a bit of vulnerability research. Due to time constraint, I couldn't cover everything. That includes the Provenance sandbox internals, other use cases, other XPR scanners, and various bugs in XPR. It's also worth noting that besides XPR, Apple has introduced a new module called XProtect Behavior Service. This is a topic for future research, but I already have some results, so stay tuned. I'm hoping to publish them later this year. Additionally, we found that Provenance attribute is also used by tracking Gatekeeper. This is another interesting target for future research. Let me close with a few key takeaways. XPR is a treasure trove of Apple's threat intelligence. Security researchers should keep an eye on newly added scanner in future updates. The Provenance attribute is a valuable forensic artifact. You can make use of it with tools I've released. Vulnerabilities in XPR and Provenance sandbox are surprisingly basic. Bugs found in other AVs or app sandbox are often directly applicable. There may be still low-hanging fruits to explore. Finally, I'd like to express my gratitude to the people listed here. I'm deeply grateful to RoachFlight and Johnson Levin for their insightful feedback on my presentation slides. As you've already seen, I created a bunch of tools during this research. I published these on GitHub repository, but for convenience, I put them all together in this one repository. Here's the link. It's also a QR code on the screen. My DMs are open on X, so if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me through social media. I'm currently working on a white paper that will include all the technical details of this research. I'll announce it on X, so once it's published, so feel free to follow me on X. Yeah, thank you very much.